I always forget to tell people that this meeting is now being recorded.
It's in the chat.
So I don't know why it's summarised. I don't know what that's supposed to mean. But anyway, maybe they take out all my waffle at the beginning and stuff like that. So it makes it sound much more professional for those listening later on. It's my pleasure to introduce today our colleagues from ADAS, Pete Berry, and I've forgotten your name already, Laurie Abel. Sorry, Laurie. I don't think I've met Laurie yet, so hopefully we'll meet you at cereals. And so they're going to give us an update on the YEN, which is the Yield Enhancement Network. And I think it was maybe about 18 months ago you spoke, Pete, before on the YEN.
Yeah,
so,
yes.
We tried to.
Yeah, we had a sort of we got halfway through and then the site had a power cut, so we got rather curtailed. So
it's
this
all
is,
coming
this
back
is
now.
take two.
Well, I'll let you get going and talk through your slides. So
yeah,
thanks very much.
Thank you, Joanne. I'll just introduce myself. I'm Pete Berry. I'm based at ADAS High Mowthorpe near York. I lead the Crop Physiology group, of which Laurie's a member of that. And Laurie, do you want to introduce yourself and say where you're focused and based?
Yes, I'm Laurie Abel. I've been part of the physiology group for two years now. I'm based up in Aberdeen, so I'm a fair bit away from the nearest office, but I help out with the tramline trails up in Scotland and the borders and with the YEN as well.
Thanks, Laurie. So we're going to do a double act. I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes on the first half, and then Laurie's going to take over, and then we'll open up for questions at the end. And obviously, as Joanne said, put your questions in the chat as well, and I'll try and answer a few of those when Laurie's speaking as well. So I'll share my slides now and get started. Okay, is that showing okay, Joanna?
Yep, it's perfect. Yep.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. So YEN Zero, YEN stands for Yield Enhancement Network, and this part of it focuses on reducing carbon emissions. It's a network of farmers, researchers and industry colleagues, and it's got a number of objectives. So the main thing is to create a community of people working out how to achieve net zero by 2040. There's 3 or 4 main areas we focus on. Firstly, we have farmers who enter information about their crops, and we calculate carbon footprints for their crops, and we benchmark those against their peers, and you'll see some outputs of that a bit later on. We share knowledge around key net zero topics, and we have within the network a series of discussion forum where we bring in external speakers, or we have internal speakers to talk about sort of interesting topics related to carbon. We have a focus on working out how to agree the right metrics and calculation approaches to make sure we're calculating carbon footprints in a similar way to everyone, and identify problem areas for other carbon calculators potentially. And we have a focus on how we can mitigate carbon emissions associated with crop production and what are the best strategies on farm. And we'll talk a bit about that later as well. So YEN Zero is sponsored by a number of industry sponsors, and many of these you'll recognise. It wouldn't exist without this sponsorship, so it's really important. And YEN Zero has been operating now for 3 and a bit years. So I'm going to start by talking a bit about the information that we get from the farmers regarding their fields and the crops that they want to have carbon footprinted, and what that carbon footprinting of those crops is telling us. So firstly, this is a summary of all the crops which have been entered into YEN Zero over the first 3 years. Each entrant or farmer can enter up to 6 crops, and you'll see we've had 88 different farmers altogether who have entered so far, and altogether 609 crops. You see, 88 times 6 doesn't equal 609. That's because we've had a number of common farmers who enter each year. So we've got 88 different farmers there. And this graph here just shows the number of different crops that we get. We get, as you might expect, the majority are feed wheat, but we've got decent numbers of oilseed rape, spring barley for malting, milling wheat, winter barley, and also spring barley for feed there, and spring oats. So we've got decent numbers of crops, and you can see they're sort of from all around the country, really. So for each crop, we ask for quite a lot of information from the farmer so we can calculate the carbon footprint as accurately as possible, and we use the latest sort of understanding of how to calculate carbon footprint to make that calculation. I'm not going to go into the sort of detail of the calculations here, but if you've got any questions, then please do just ask away. I'm going to launch straight into results on what those calculations are telling us. So firstly, this is a summary of the carbon footprint of the different crops in terms of kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per hectare. And you can see you've got all the different crops we've got on the x-axis there. The green columns represent the carbon footprint per hectare, and the orange dots represent the number of entries. And you can sort of categorize the different crops into 3 different categories. You've got the nitrogen fixing crops, which have the lowest carbon footprint, mainly because they don't have any synthetic nitrogen fertilizer applied. You've got a middle sort of set of crop species, the low N input cereals, and you've got the high N input crops, which are things like milling wheat and also oilseed rape, which have the highest footprint per hectare. So that's on a per hectare basis. Now the next slide is going to talk about the emissions on a per tonne basis. So we're simply dividing the per hectare emissions by the yield in tonnes per hectare. And you get a similar pattern. You get the lower sort of category are your nitrogen fixing crops, but also maize, because it's got such a high yield, it gets diluted, and rye, which has a generally a low carbon footprint because it generally has low levels of nitrogen fertilizer applied. Then you've got your cereals in the middle, and then you've got your oilseeds, linseed and oilseed rape at the upper end. They're mainly high because they've got a lower yield. It might be between 2 and 5 tonnes per hectare for linseed and oilseed rape. I often think the oilseeds get a bit of a bad rap because they have got a high energy content as well. So if we were to calculate this on a kilograms of CO2 per megajoule of energy, they would look a bit better. So it's worth bearing that in mind. And then now let's look at the sources of those greenhouse gas emissions. So what's responsible for those carbon emissions, and we've calculated these in a number of different sources. For wheat, this is feed wheat here, an average of all the crops we've looked at. You can see that about 25% of the emissions come from the manufacture of nitrogen fertilizer, and then a similar amount comes from nitrous oxide emissions, which are released upon application of the nitrogen fertilizer. So you got half of the total emissions coming from nitrogen fertilizer. Operations are the next largest category, which come from the diesel fuel used to establish the crop, to apply sprays of fertilizer, harvest, bale, dry the grain. All that comes under operations. Crop residues, you're thinking, what is that? Well, that is after the crop's been harvested and the residues of a crop decompose, they release nitrous oxide, and that's what is responsible for those emissions. And then we've got some of the crops, but not all of them, have organic materials applied, mainly manure, and you've got a proportion of greenhouse gases coming from that. So that gives you sort of a picture of what's responsible for the different emissions. I should say that the ag chems, often, the ag chems are sort of seen as really important, but the ag chems only account for 1% of the total emissions. So that's the manufacture costs in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. of things like fungicides and herbicides and pesticides really don't amount to very much at all. Milling wheat, very similar pattern, a bit more emissions from the nitrogen fertilizer because you have to apply a bit more N to get the milling quality. Spring barley, again, pretty similar, but you've got less N applied. So proportionally, you've got less of the emissions coming from nitrogen fertilizer, and you've got more proportion coming from the operations. Oilseed rape, similar, but the main difference here is you've got much more coming from the decomposition of residues because you've got much larger residues in oilseed rape. And beans, massively different. You haven't got any fertilizer applied, nitrogen fertilizer that is. So the majority of the emissions are coming from the operations and the decomposition of residues. So that gives you the idea of what's the sources of the emissions. What we've then done with the data is try to use it to understand what are the drivers of variation in greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm going to start with winter wheat and then move on to spring barley before passing on to Laurie. Start with winter wheat because this is obviously the International Barley Hub, so I'm going to come on to the barley, but because we've got a much bigger data set on the wheat, you can see the power of the data with this analysis best. So the columns represent the greenhouse gas emissions of each individual field or crop that we've measured in kilograms of CO2 per tonne. And you can see that ranges from about 600 at one end to less than 200 at the other end. So you've got a threefold variation there. That is massive. In some ways, that's one of the biggest messages here. There's a huge range of greenhouse gas emissions between crops, threefold variation there. And then the yellow dots are the yields. And you can see the sort of a gradual trend for higher yields with the associated with lower carbon footprint per tonne. And then what we've done with this data is to partition it into the lower third of greenhouse gas emissions per tonne and compared the crop management approaches for growing those crops with the crops in the upper third of greenhouse gas emissions per tonne, just to see if there's any inherent differences in the way that the crops with a low carbon footprint are managed compared with the high carbon footprint crops. And this is what it shows. So what we've got here, we've got two columns. We've got the red column, that's the bad column. That's the crops with a high carbon footprint. And we've got the blue column, good column, the low carbon footprint crops. And this is the average values of the crops in each of those thirds. So carbon footprint wise, obviously, as you might expect, there's a much higher carbon footprint in kilograms of CO2 per tonne in the higher third of crops compared to the lower third of crops. Interestingly, the lower third of crops have a higher yield, almost 2 tonnes per hectare higher yielding than the upper third. In terms of the fertiliser, the lower third of greenhouse gas emission crops have a lower nitrogen fertiliser application, 159 kilograms per hectare compared to 198. And that's despite them yielding more, 10.8 tonnes per hectare, notice. These crops had a greater proportion had a nitrification inhibitor applied, so that's reducing the nitrous oxide emissions and reducing the carbon footprint. Interestingly, they had less manure applied and they also had less other fertiliser applied, P, K and lime. I'll come on to that later. It's interesting. I mean, we're certainly not advocating that you should be applying no manure or less manure and no P and K. You need that. It's likely that these applications are occurring elsewhere in the rotation. But nonetheless, it's interesting to see that does contribute to the lower carbon footprint of those crops. And then in terms of the other parameters, we've got percentage of crops following a non-cereal crop. So you've got 65% of the crops in the low carbon footprint column are following a non-cereal crop, so a break crop, so they're probably having less nitrogen fertilizer applied. You've got more residues from the greenhouse gas from the residue decomposition, and that's probably because it's higher yielding. Also means it's probably got more straw to decompose, so you get more emissions from that. There's a few more, great percentage of crops which have chopped straw. This is a significant one, the grain drying. There's much less greenhouse gas emissions from drying the crops for the low carbon footprint third of crops, and also those lower third have less greenhouse gas emissions associated with cultivations, much of which comes from the fact that more of them, 47%, are direct drilled compared to just 23% for the high carbon footprint crops. So it gives us an idea about what's driving the variation in the carbon footprint. And if we move on to the spring barley now, it's a smaller data set, so it's not as powerful. You can't detect as much statistical significance here, but I'll show you what we've got. No difference in yield, although there's no difference in yields in terms of the lower third and upper third. In terms of nitrogen, there are significant differences. So similar to the wheat, your crops with a lower carbon footprint have less nitrogen fertilizer applied, 110 kilograms of N per hectare compared to 135. And similar again to the wheat, they have less of the crops have manure applied and less have lime and P and K applied. In terms of other metrics, there's no difference in the greenhouse gas emissions from crop residue decomposition or from the proportion of crops which had their straw chopped, but there are significant differences in the amount of crops which had significant grain drying requirements, and also the low carbon footprint crops had less greenhouse gas emissions from cultivations, and proportionally more were directly drilled. So pretty similar to the wheat. And again, it's given us some ideas about what are the drivers for low carbon footprint crops. So in terms of the messages which are coming out of this, you can sort of categorize the different crop species into three types really. For pulses having the lowest carbon emissions per hectare, then you've got low N input cereals like spring barley in the middle, and then you've got high input cereals like milling wheat and rape at the upper end. Importantly, there's a threefold range of carbon intensity for crops within any crop species. So there's a massive range there which needs to be understood. In terms of the sources of emissions, the majority are coming from fertilizer for cereals and oilseed rape, and then you've got smaller amounts from manure, the operations and the decomposition of residues. For pulses, it's different. You've got most of the emissions are coming from operations, the diesel used to establish and manage the crops, and the decomposition of the residues. In terms of drivers of crops with low greenhouse gas emissions, they include higher yields, lower rates of synthetic fertilizer, less intensive cultivations, less grain drying. Wheat was often following a non-break crop, but also interestingly, we had less manures and less PK fertilizer. But we need to recognise that those inputs are going to be applied somewhere else in the rotation. You can't get away without using them at all. And we'll come on to the fact that looking at this on a whole rotation basis is one of the places we want to go next, so we can better account for those sorts of inputs which occur not every year but every few years. Okay, I will stop sharing and ask Laurie to share her slides.
Right. We all see that?
Yep, looks good.
Yeah, perfect. Right, thank you, Pete. I will be going through these two reports, which the growers get out of Yen Zero. So we've got the crop carbon footprint analysis report and the benchmarking reports. So we've got a brief overview of the results report. So this results report gives a background to carbon footprinting, a summary of emissions, a detailed background individual to each entry, a general overview of soil health, and a bespoke mitigation practice tree that I will go over in the next few slides. And an overview of the benchmarking report. So we've got a dataset summary, an average crop carbon footprints, detailed benchmarking of greenhouse gas emissions for each entry, and a colour-coded KPI table. So here we've got an example of the 2023 Yen Zero report. This is describing the assessment of greenhouse gas emissions. So this is carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide is all converted to carbon dioxide equivalents. So, sorry guys, it's the dogs. And so this graph shows the total greenhouse gas emissions on a per hectare basis for each entry. The differing colours represent the emission sources. So we've got, you can see the bar graph at the bottom. So each of the different colours is down here. So that's different sources. Entry 3 up the top here is the winter malting barley entry. And on this graph here, so on the right hand side graph, splits the emission sources. So you can see that the main source of greenhouse gas emissions comes from the manufacture and application of the synthetic N. This example of the winter barley, but this is an example of winter barley, but you get these pages for each of the fields that each grower has entered as well. Right, and now we move on to the mitigation practice tree. So the mitigation practice tree is bespoke to each grower based on a set of questions from the Yen 0 forms. So there are 50 questions that are asked to each grower, which they respond with either yes, no, partially, or not applicable in terms of whether they have applied the practice or not. The 50 questions correspond to the 50 practices in the mitigation practice table, which we'll see in a few slides as well. So we have a piece of code that converts all the answers given to these 50 questions, and this then creates this mitigation tree here that you can see on the right hand side. So to go through the mitigation tree, so each circle is a practice. So these are all numbered, and you will see later on in the table of 50. And then the practices are grouped by theme. So you can see we've got fertilizer, productivity, soil health, and energy. So these focus on similar areas or objectives, and they're located near each other on the diagram, making it easier to understand how different practices relate and contribute to overall goals on the farm. And then the core practices are in the middle here. They're foundational to the rest of the practices that follow. So these practices are essential and form the foundation to the rest, into the outer circle. And their central placement highlights their importance and the role they play in supporting the rest of the practices to follow. So as we go out towards the edge of the tree, these practices are more difficult or expensive to implement. So the ones in the core practices in the middle are easier to implement on farm, and then they get more difficult and more expensive as you go out. And the size of the circle as well. So this is relative to the impact. So you can see 12 and 22 are quite large circles, so they've got a larger impact than 24, which is here, and 11. Perfect. And then the color of the circle is the current status. So you can see that we've got white. So the white means that it is not started yet and not implemented. Yellow is partially implemented, so the farmer has started this practice, but he maybe doesn't practice it to the full ability. And then we've got green as well, which is fully implemented. So there's quite a few here in fertilizer and productivity. You can maybe use more in the other themes there as well. And we'll go on to the next slide to go through an example. So like I kind of just explained, I'll explain it again. So to start at the base of the tree, so we start with these 4 practices here, and then we work outwards on each theme. So we look at for the next practice in chain that hasn't been implemented. So for productivity, for example, you would look at number 6, and for fertilizer, you'd look at 11, that's the core that hasn't been implemented, or 24 or 26. Preferably 26 because it's got a bigger impact than 24. So yeah, again, prioritize the higher impact practices. focus on areas where less work has been done. So, like I said, they've got quite a lot implemented or already partially implemented in fertiliser and productivity. So it'd make more sense to focus on energy and soil health. So having a look at this tree, you create an initial list of 5 to 10 practices that you would like to look at or begin to look at. So, and then you take them 5 to 10 practices and then prioritise 3. So this list of 5 or 10, and then we'll look at 3. So I think we've chosen these 3, 1, because it's in productivity and it's the start, the core practice there, 39 and 11. So look at these here. So this is the 50 practices that the 50 questions are based on here, across the different themes that's in the mitigation tree. So the 3 that we looked at would be soil nutrient and pH sampling, so ensure nutrients are not limiting. In this example, number 1 is partially implemented and at the base of the tree, so the grower potentially benefit from developing this further. And then we've got 11, which is the measure soil mineral N plus crop N and base nitrogen rates on realistic yield and quality expectations. So 11 was again at the base of the tree, so it's a core practice, important to look at. And the 3rd practice is soil organic matter sampling and monitoring. Another core practice at the base of the tree that had not been implemented, exploring practices related to soil health and energy, were the themes that the farmer was lacking in. So it could be beneficial for the grower. And then, so you've got these 3, chosen these 3, your priorities of them. So it'd be next to explore the opportunities and barriers of implementing these 3, and then make an action plan if you think these are doable and implement them on the farm. So that was a very brief overview of the carbon footprint analysis report and the mitigation tree. And we'll move on to the benchmarking report. So here we have, this here explains the use of the box and whisker diagram within the yen 0 benchmarking process. So this here highlights the highest value in yen, and then we've got the lowest value down here and the middle value here. So this box between the highest and lowest is the middle 50% of all yen values. So that's all the values that we have in yen. And then these coloured lines here are the field values from the farmer. Pardon me, so the you'll see in, yes, this one here. So oh, there we go. So this box and whisker diagram provides a look at whether you are performing higher or lower than other growers within yen 0. So this is in terms of greenhouse gas emissions associated with your crop management. You can see in this example here with the pink line here and your box and whisker here, so that's your winter barley. So you can see in this example that the malting winter barley performed relatively poorly compared to the other barley entries in yen 0, because it is one of the highest yen values across. That's per emissions per hectare as well. So he has also got winter wheat, rye and spring beans, and then oats as well. So he's performing relatively on average with the middle 50 across the other crops. But yeah, you can see it's quite high per carbon equivalent per hectare for his winter barley there. There. So this is also continuing with the greenhouse gas emissions. So this graph here shows the breakdown of the greenhouse gas emissions into sources again for each of the growers' entered fields. So you can see that the highlighted barley entry there and down here as well. So this graph shows the yield and greenhouse gas emissions per tonne for the barley entry here. So you can see that there's also a high yield per hectare. the greenhouse gas emissions per tonne, because there's a higher yield, are lower than the carbon equivalent per hectare as well. So in the below graph, in this one here, the grower can see where the highest sources of emissions are with this particular crop. So in this case, N is applied in the form of manure, so there is being a reduction in the synthetic applications. So they're relatively low compared to the other entries in yen. So this field performs well, but to look at maybe savings on your emissions, it's probably best to look at the operations here. He's doing relatively well, but it would be probably operations would be best to look at here. So yeah, see what he can change there in regards to cultivations, drilling, spray applications, or baling, and your drying costs as well. But yeah, this gives a brief overview of how well the crop's doing with the greenhouse gas emissions per tonne. That's, I think, a brief overview from me. Yeah, and I'll pass back on to Pete.
Thanks, Laurie. Yeah, so just to finish, we're constantly looking to, can you keep sharing?
Oh, sorry, Pete, that was my fault. I'm trying to mute myself.
We're constantly looking to keep evolving the yen zero. So things we're looking at the moment and further into the future are to develop a mitigation guidance that Laurie just described, so that it links with guidance. It isn't just a sort of, you try and do this. It gives you some more help really as to how to do it. We're looking to do more testing ideas in the field to reduce carbon footprint and to sort of get experiences from other farmers as to what works best. We are developing the output metrics so that they plot the greenhouse gas emission intensity in CO2 per tonne against the yield. And the reason for doing that is because it is quite easy potentially to have a low carbon footprint just by not applying any fertilizer, for example, but you wouldn't get very much yield either. And, we've still got to feed the world. So ideally, we want low carbon footprint and high yield. So we're adding that to the output metrics in the reports. And finally, as I sort of mentioned in my half, the looking at it on a whole rotation basis is really important, because looking at a snapshot of a single crop can be a bit misleading, particularly for some of the inputs which occur over not every year. So we want to develop it so we can calculate the footprint over the whole rotation. And if you have any ideas as to what other areas to branch into, please don't hesitate to suggest them. If you could go on to the next slide, please, Laurie. And we'll finish just by thanking again all the sponsors of Yen Zero, because we couldn't do it without all their support. So thank you. And yeah, Joanna, we open up to questions.
Thanks very much. That's great. Well, people, I don't know if there's anyone in the chat just yet. Did you say that how long do you go back to fields from every year, the same fields, to see how they're changing the practices?
Yeah, we generally know. Farmer entrants will sort of select a range of fields that they're interested in from the previous year and enter data describing those crops. But in the last year, we have sort of developed the input portal so that you can choose one field and input data from the last 6 crops from that field. So we've basically got a rotation of information, and we can calculate the footprint over the whole rotation. So it's some and some, and I think we'd like to move more to calculating it on a rotational basis and then getting a big enough data set to be able to benchmark rotations. That's what really matters. And I think the most effective ways of reducing carbon footprints are using a systems type of approach, really. So you're using manures to reduce the reliance on synthetic fertilizers over the long term, over the whole rotation. For example, you're using break crops to try and improve productivity of crops. So I think that would be where we want to end up in the short term.
There's a couple of questions coming in the chat. And also, I think Catherine has her hand up. Catherine, would you like to ask your question first?
Thanks for a really interesting talk. I kind of wholeheartedly agree about rotation, so I'm intrigued as to how you're going to define a rotation as one thing.
I know. Well,
we have a small amount of data on that from an old AHD project, DB project, but yeah, trying to define exactly what constitutes a rotation, because each crop has a different period in it.
Difficult and almost impossible, actually. I mean, a lot of farmers and agronomists will have a target rotation that they aim for, but it's invariably buggered up by the weather. So what you hope for, I guess, is they can find a field which has a sequence of previous crops which is pretty much approximates to their target rotation, and to enter information about the management of those crops to give them an idea of what the footprint is over their whole rotation. It's going to be difficult to do, but hopefully not impossible.
So I'm slightly sneakily going to try and squeeze something else in. Have you thought in terms of calculating per caloric output?
Yeah, I have, and I think that is,
and potentially, given the way that subsidies and things work,
yeah,
per pound or per unit profit or something. If you want to get people to really buy into, actually, you might be reducing your yield, but it might be worth your while.
Was your first question per calorie?
Yeah, or something like that.
Yeah. So yes, I mean, I think that calculating the carbon footprint in terms of kilograms of CO2 per megajoule or calorie produced is really where we want to be, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to grow a crop which sort of uses the sun's energy and converts it into some useful energy for humans and animals to use. So I think that's where we ultimately want to be, and that's sort of why I mentioned the oilseeds getting a bad rap, because they have a high energy density, but if you calculate their emissions on a per ton basis, they don't look as good. So that is something we could develop into, yes. Profitability wise, yeah, that is something else we keep thinking about, but not grasping that nettle, I must admit. The reason being that it's quite difficult to put a price on all the inputs, because everybody buys at different amounts or buys the same product for a different value often. I mean, you could use default parameters, but then you've got so many different fungicide products, for example, that would be a big job, sort of quantifying all of those. You could ask the farmer to use their farm management software, which kind of gives an output really of how much they've spent on fungicides or crop protection. That might be the simplest way of doing it if they've got information to hand. But yeah, it is something we'd like to go to. And then, yeah, if you could sort of show, using carbon efficient crop management approaches at least doesn't lose you any money, that would be a really good message, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a reason it hasn't been done. It's really tough.
Yeah,
it is. I think if you're going down the rotational route, it becomes pretty important.
Yeah.
Because you're not just benchmarking against other people using the same crops, you're benchmarking against entire crop cycles.
Yeah, that's true. Yep, good point. Yep.
So we have a couple of questions in the chat. Luke's wondering whether you are picking up geographical or regional trends amongst your farmers.
Not that I've noticed so far, no. No, and we've also looked at sort of where there's any difference between years as well, and there's no clear difference between the years. So not really, I would say.
Do you have any sites in Scotland, Pete?
Yes, there's quite a few sites in Scotland. Yeah.
Be interesting to have a look and see how variable they are compared to some of your southern sites.
Some sort of geographical differences for some crops, particularly related to yield. You look at oilseed rape yields over the last few years, and they've been much higher in Scotland than in England. So there could be lower carbon footprints per tonne as a result of that.
Yeah.
I haven't noticed anything obvious coming out, but yeah, we haven't actually done that specific test yet, have we, Laurie? So worth looking at that.
I think someone asked that last time as well. So yeah, we definitely worth looking at the Scottish one.
Yeah.
I think Abdul Aziz has a question. Abdul, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, Joanne, thanks, Pete, for this nice presentation. It's indeed educative. My question is, what software or methods did you use in estimating the carbon footprinting? And also, I have another question. Does varying the number of nitrogen split applications leads to significant reduction in carbon footprinting in spring barley?
Yep. Okay. First question, we use our own method, but it's quite similar to the method used by a lot of the carbon calculators out there. But we use, wherever possible, published data. We use IPCC sort of approved methodologies. We've updated it this year actually for some of the new sort of science which has come out on climate change. So it's not one particular method that we use. We just use the best approach for each calculation that we can find. And then the question about whether number of splits of nitrogen affects the carbon footprint, I don't know. We have got that information. We haven't looked at that yet. We've got the number of splits. I don't know. That's something to look at. Good question.
Because the reason why I asked this second question is that my trial is already established on site now, and I'm trying to vary the number of times of nitrogen split application to calculate carbon footprinting and see whether that has an effect in the amount of carbon emitted from spring barley production.
Yeah. I mean, you're going to emit a little bit more carbon just through an extra fertilizer pass. So there's going to be another operation or two in that. So you're really hoping that you're going to increase the yield and dilute the carbon emissions through that approach. So it'd be an interesting question. We can look at that.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we've got a question that probably quite a few people are thinking about that Nick Pitts is asking from SWRI. This difference between the yields when you've got lower carbon farms, seem the yield often is either better than higher carbon farms. And he's asking whether, you kind of try to calculate things like whether it's geography or soil type and whether those play into the farm yields.
Yeah, so the question is really about what's the driver of the variation in yield. Is that right, Joanne?
Yeah, when you've got lower carbon, your lower carbon ones have either yields very similar or slightly higher than the higher carbon users. So is it, things like soil types?
Well, we don't know. I can't answer that definitively. What I will say is that in the crop yen that we have, where we have several thousand data points now for wheat, for example, when we analyse what the drivers of yield are in that, and that's over the last 10 years, then we found a large proportion of the variation is determined by what is something called the farm factor. So it's things like inputs, nitrogen inputs, fungicide inputs. Yeah, there is often a positive association, but not that strong. But the farm factor accounts for quite a lot of variation, a substantial amount of variation, in fact. And we attribute that to the farmer's skill, basically, their attention to detail. They're basically getting more yield with the same level of inputs. And it's not because they're farming on better soil, because we can sort of analyze the data in such a way that we can sort of disentangle the soil type factor and the regional factor and the crop factor from the sort of farm factor. So farm factor, I would say, is the most likely reason for variation in yield and the ability of some farms to produce more yield with the same or fewer inputs.
I think Steve has a bit of a comment and a question. Steve Holt's asking whether you've had any policy dialogue with any of the people who, I guess, hand out money for farmers and various things like that, and whether there's any direction travel with that.
Your voice has got a bit crackly, Joanne. I'm just is that question written down actually from Steve?
Yes, it is. Yes, Steve,
Yeah,
Steve's online. So
oh, okay, yeah.
Steve, do you want to ask that?
Yes, hi Pete, hi Laurie.
Hi Steve.
Yeah, excellent stuff. Yeah, no, it's really, the main thing was really about any interest you've had from sort of policy and the policy angle yet, because obviously this could have quite a lot of implications, the way this production environmental sort of kind of balance is viewed in future.
Yeah, no, we haven't had any discussions with policy. I mean, NFU are one of the sponsors of Yen Zero, but we haven't sort of got into detailed discussions about policy with them yet, for example. Yeah, I mean, this sort of data set I think is useful for helping to develop policy and in helping us to get to net zero by 2040, isn't it? So yeah, very happy to have a chat about that, Steve, and what potential there is there.
No, thanks very much, and I like the idea of the rotations, and then adding the other currencies such as the value of the product, the energy, the calories, and all these other things.
Yeah, I know they're all good things. In some ways, we need some more. We need more sponsors to help us to achieve all these things.
Yeah,
but, it's really exciting things to get into, aren't they?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Kevin Stickney. Calorie-based metrics would skew against pulses and general protein, i.e. from an animal perspective. You may need indexation that includes premium and essential amino acids. So that's a comment.
That's a good point. Yes, I mean, in some ways, the metric you choose, it's never going to be perfect for all of them, is it? Yeah, we can move on to a calorific kind of footing. And then, yeah, I hadn't really thought about that, but there's more to it than just calories in terms of the feed value. So, yeah, indexing method. Yeah, I mean, if you've got an idea as to how to do that, I'm all ears, because that would move things along a bit for us. And we don't want to sort of negatively, impact on some of the crop species like the pulses, as you suggest.
Kevin, do you have an answer? Do you have a protocol for indexing?
The answer is no, I don't, because it's, as Pete points out, it's damn complicated, and I could be boring and then go into phosphorus contribution and various other nutrients coming from different crops. It is a tricky one, but it's certainly, when you look at justification for growing a crop, you can't rely on pulses as being the previous crop and the carryover of nitrogen being all there is, because certainly as a nutritionist, I look at a vast range of parameters that influence my valuation, and certainly I try and I'd probably even go the metric also it needs to include water demand on that crop. If you're being very pedantic, it's something that needs thinking about. And I mean, Catherine makes the point about linear programming. That's exactly what I use for producing rations, and that's how you pull these numbers together.
No, I'm aware of it. Linear programming. It's a really good point, because you don't want to sort of draw the wrong conclusions from this data about what crops are the most carbon efficient and what aren't. So we do need to get some careful thought about this.
Thank you.
Good point.
Laurie, I was going to ask you about your network diagram, and the example you gave. Whichever farm that was, you had your kind of diamond in the middle where that those were the main ones that you should be doing. There was two that hadn't actually started. What was the kind of implication of them not doing those bits? Is that they didn't do the trial, and so that would be something you would recommend the following years for them to try?
I think I got most of your questions. Did you? Was it the so 11 and 39 were the base of the tree?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that farmer themselves weren't measuring the soil mineral N. Sorry. So obviously that would benefit them on how much N they're adding to their crops. So yeah, it's just to look at the practices and see where they could be improving and what they could do. If they were doing all of them, then you would think that their overall emissions would probably be lower than someone that was doing very limited amounts of the practices in the tree. I hope that kind of answers your question there.
I'm just interested to find out whether, you pointed that out to the right. You could have done those ones and that might have made a huge difference. But
I mean, it's worth saying, isn't it, Laurie, that of all the sort of feedback we get on the reports, the sort of some of the most positives about the mitigation tree, and I think it's because it's very difficult for many farmers to know where to start in terms of reducing their carbon footprint. There's so many things they could do, and it's difficult to know what impact they might have on carbon footprint. So this is, although it's not perfect in any way, it gives it a way of sort of prioritising where to focus. And once you've started the process, in some ways that's the most difficult step, I think.
Yep. Thank you. Has anybody got any questions? If you'd just like to raise your hand, there's nothing else in the chat. Oh, Mike Whittington has a question. Mike, do you want to ask that, or are you indisposed?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Thanks very much, Peter and Laurie. Yeah, that was
really
interesting. Yeah, a really interesting presentation. Yeah, just what I put into the chat was that it seems that the work you're doing would be really, really helpful in terms of full life cycle assessment.
Yeah,
the actual production of the crop, and you've touched on some of the upstream and aspects like the fertilizer production, but also a very large percentage of the total GHGs from the whole food system comes from the downstream. What the product is then used for, how it's processed, transported. So what you've done seems to provide a really important part of the building the basis on the actual crop production side, and would then feed into really nicely into full life cycle assessments of the food system. So thanks for that.
You're dead right. Yes, it could be useful for that, couldn't it? We draw a boundary around the farm gate basically for this, and it's soil surface sort of budget in many respects. But that's a good point. And the other thing that just occurred to me when you were saying that, Mike, is that we've also developing the output metrics to calculate the nitrogen budget, the nitrogen balance of each crop. Because nitrogen is so influential on the carbon footprint, and we collect all the right parameters for calculating the nitrogen use efficiency and the nitrogen budget and the nitrogen balance. So that is another one of the sort of output metrics we now put in the reports. So it's not just sort of downstream, Mike, I suppose. We could also calculate some other metrics coming out of with this data set as well.
So I think unless there's any more questions, I think we just like to thank both of you for your really interesting talk.
I can see one more question, Joanne, from Kevin about the manures, which is a good question as well. The manure question is very interesting because the reason crops with more organic material, manure applied, end up with higher greenhouse gas emissions is because of the way you calculate the carbon footprint associated with manures. So not only have you got quite a sizable carbon footprint coming from the actual application of the organic manures onto the field, the diesel use, but also you calculate the carbon footprint associated with manures from the total nitrogen content, and and that's associated with a sort of efficiency factor. And you might think, oh, well, that's fine. That'll be just compensated because we'll apply less synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. But it doesn't stack up like that, because if you think about farmyard manure, it might have 100 kilograms of N per hectare total N in it, but only 10% of that is plant available. So the actual reduction in synthetic N that you get as a result of applying manure is modest at best, but you still get a big carbon footprint from it, which isn't compensated for by the reduction in nitrogen fertilizer. So you end up with a bigger carbon footprint when you're using manures. Now, over the long term, the fact that you're putting more carbon into the soil, the fact that you'll have more sort of mineralization because you've got more organic matter for following crops and things like that, it's not accounted for in a single crop analysis. It might be more accounted for in the whole rotation. But you can see that's one of the issues we've identified within this analysis.
Mike's asking if
yeah, sure, yeah, we can
see
send a
that?
copy of slides. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, I think any more questions? That's great. Well, thank you very much. That was really interesting, and I guess we'll look forward to hearing from you for the next round of when you do the next year, and seeing how things change.
Yeah.
No, that's brilliant. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanne. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.